For the first time in years, Sophie Langford woke up to silence. Not the anxious, lonely kind, but the peaceful kind. The kind that came with the sound of soft breathing beside her. George was sprawled out on her bed, one arm over his face, hair a mess, sheets tangled around him. She watched him, the city light slipping through her curtains and painting his skin gold. It was absurd, she thought. She was the CEO of a Fortune 500 company, a woman used to boardrooms, billion-dollar deals, and 6 a.m. flights. And yet, the most grounding part of her day was watching a man who made pancakes and fixed leaky faucets snore beside her. By 8 a.m., George was in her kitchen wearing her apron. "You're using my apron?" she asked, crossing her arms. "Technically," he said, flipping a pancake, "it's our apron now." Bold assumption. "I'm an optimist." Sophie smirked. "You're an idiot." That too. It felt domestic, dangerously so. The kind of routine that could easily become habit. They started to spend more time together. Mornings at Central Park with coffee and bagels. Afternoons with George, teasing her for answering emails on a picnic blanket. Evenings spent in her penthouse kitchen, where Sophie pretended not to notice how easily her walls were crumbling. Sometimes she'd catch herself staring at him, the way he smiled, how he listened, how he didn't care about her title or her money. It terrified her more than any corporate merger ever had. But peace, as Sophie knew too well, was always temporary. It began subtly. A strange email, a board member asking too many questions about her personal associations. Then the photos leaked. A gossip site posted blurry pictures of Sophie and George walking hand in hand through Central Park. CEO Langford's secret lover, the house husband who stole her heart. By the next morning, her PR team was in chaos. "We can't spin this easily," her assistant panicked. "Then don't," Sophie said calmly. "I'm not ashamed." But she was not of George, never of him, but of how easily her carefully built life was unraveling again. That night, she met George at his apartment. It was small but warm, filled with books and plants, a world away from her penthouse. "You saw the headlines?" she asked. "Hard to miss," he said lightly. "They called me a domestic dreamboat." "You're enjoying this?" "A little," he admitted, grinning. "Not every guy gets to be a scandal." But Sophie didn't laugh. "This could hurt me, George. My board, my reputation." "Your image," he said softly, "not you." That stopped her. He stepped closer. "You don't have to keep performing, Sophie. You don't have to prove anything anymore." Her voice cracked. "You don't get it. I fought to be taken seriously. I had to become someone I don't even recognize sometimes." George cupped her face gently. "Then maybe it's time to remember who you are. Not the CEO, not the survivor, just you." She stared at him, eyes glassy. "You make it sound easy." "It's not, but it's worth it." Later that night, they sat together on his old couch, watching some low-budget sitcom rerun. Sophie's head rested on his shoulder, her shoes kicked off, laughter coming easier than it had in years. The world outside could spin, gossip, judge. She didn't care. In this small apartment, peace didn't feel fragile anymore. It felt real. Until her phone buzzed. She picked it up, frowning, an unknown number. "Unknown, you really think you can just erase the past?" "Unknown, Melissa hasn't forgotten." Her heart dropped. George noticed the color drain from her face. "Sophie, what's wrong?" She looked up at him, voice trembling. "It's starting again." New York never truly slept, but tonight, Sophie couldn't either. Her phone screen still glowed with those two words that made her stomach twist. Melissa hasn't forgotten. She hadn't seen or heard from Melissa in months. After Ethan's downfall, Melissa vanished from social media, her influencer empire collapsing under the weight of exposed lies and unpaid debts. Everyone assumed she'd moved on. Sophie wanted to believe it too. But now, as rain tapped against her office windows, she knew better. George came over that morning, coffee in one hand, worry in the other. "You look like you haven't slept," he said softly. "I didn't," she admitted. "Melissa's back." "You sure it's her?" That message was too specific. She knows things only she and Ethan did. George frowned. "She's trying to get in your head again. Don't let her." "I'm not afraid of her," Sophie said, packing. "I'm afraid of what she'll do." He walked closer, putting a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Then we deal with it together." For a moment, she just looked at him. He wasn't a strategist or a corporate fixer. He wasn't part of her world. But he was her anchor. And for the first time, she didn't have to fight alone. 2 days later, Sophie received an invitation. A handwritten card in an elegant gold envelope. "To the woman who took everything, let's finish this where it all began." M. The address, Luna Soiree Charity Gala, Manhattan. Melissa's favorite haunt, where she used to flaunt her designer dresses and rich connections. Sophie clenched the card, her chest tightening. "She's baiting me," she muttered. "Then maybe it's time someone takes the bait back," George said. The night of the gala shimmered with Manhattan decadence. Chandeliers, champagne, whispers that tasted like gold and gossip. Sophie arrived in a sleek black dress, her confidence a weapon, her nerves a battlefield. George came as her date, black suit, calm smile, eyes scanning every corner like a quiet protector. It didn't take long for Melissa to appear. She looked radiant, like sin wrapped in satin. Her smile could have cut glass. "Sophie Langford," Melissa purred, still pretending to be perfect. "Melissa," Sophie said evenly, still pretending to be relevant. The crowd buzzed, polite smiles masking hungry curiosity. Melissa leaned in. "You think you won. You think Ethan's fall fixed everything. I lost everything because of you." "You lost everything because of your own choices," Sophie replied, her tone sharp but steady. "Please," Melissa sneered. "You think people don't talk. You think your little house husband doesn't have skeletons of his own." George stiffened beside Sophie. "Leave him out of this," Sophie said quietly. "Why? You left me to burn while you found your redemption romance." Sophie's voice dropped to a whisper. "You used people, Melissa. You used me. You used everyone who tried to care about you." For a second, something flickered in Melissa's eyes, guilt, pain, then bitterness. "You stole my life." "No," Sophie said softly. "You gave it away." The crowd was silent. Cameras flashed. And just like that, Melissa's facade cracked, mascara streaking, fury trembling beneath her words. "You'll regret this," she hissed. "Both of you." She stormed off, leaving the whispers behind her like ashes. Later that night, on the quiet drive home, George finally asked, "Do you think she'll stop?" Sophie sighed. "No, but I think she's finally lost her audience." They reached her penthouse. Sophie kicked off her heels and slumped onto the couch. George joined her, handing her a glass of wine. "For surviving another storm," he said. "Barely." "You did more than that. You stood up for yourself, for us." She looked at him, really looked at him, and something inside her softened. "You make it sound noble." "It is noble. You didn't fight to win anymore, Sophie. You fought to be free." Her eyes glistened. "You think we're free now?" "Maybe not yet," he said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "But we're getting closer." That night, Sophie fell asleep in George's arms as rain whispered against the windows. Outside, the city pulsed like a heartbeat, relentless, alive. And though shadows still lingered, Sophie knew this time, she wasn't facing them alone. For the first time in weeks, Sophie felt calm. Melissa had retreated, her threats dissolving into silence. The media had moved on to newer scandals. And George, her George, was still there, making her laugh, grounding her in a world that had once felt too sharp to touch. But peace never lasts long when the past still has teeth. It started with a headline. Langford CEO's lover exposed. Shocking truth about George Bennett's past. Sophie's phone buzzed nonstop. Calls, texts, emails. Her PR team in meltdown. Her assistant's voice shaky over the line. "Ma'am, you need to see this." She opened the article. There he was, George Bennett, smiling in a photo from years ago. Below it, former small business owner accused of embezzlement, settled privately, tied to a failed charity project involving misuse of funds. Sophie's chest tightened. She read the article twice, then a third time. No, it couldn't be true. He'd told her everything. Hadn't he? That evening, George came home, humming softly until he saw her face. "Sophie." "Sit down," she said, her tone brittle. He froze, reading the air like a man who already knew what was coming. "You saw it," he murmured. "You didn't think to tell me." George rubbed his temples. "I was going to. I just didn't want that part of me to touch you." "You mean the part where you were accused of stealing from a charity?" Her voice cracked, the pain sharper than the accusation. "It wasn't like that," he said quickly. "It was my ex-business partner. He framed me to cover his own debts. I took the settlement to protect my sister. She was pregnant then, and the stress." "So you lied by omission." "I was ashamed," he said, voice rising. "You think I wanted the woman I loved to see me as a failure." The room went still. His words hung between them like thunder. "You love me," Sophie whispered. "Yeah," he said hoarsely. "And that's exactly why I didn't want to lose you to some stupid mistake from my past." Tears welled in her eyes. "George, you could have trusted me." "You say that," he said quietly, "but you live in a world where one headline could destroy everything you built. I didn't want to be your weakness." Sophie turned away, blinking back tears. "You were never my weakness," she whispered. "You were the one thing that made me feel strong again." He reached for her, but she stepped back. "I just need time," she said softly. "Please." George left that night. The city felt colder without him. Sophie kept replaying the argument, his voice echoing. "I didn't want to lose you." She wanted to forgive him, she did, but the wound of betrayal still burned. Not because of what he did, but because he didn't trust her enough to tell her. 2 days later, Sophie's assistant rushed into her office. "You'll want to see this," she said, setting down her tablet. It was a video, a leaked recording from the same reporter who'd written the expose. Melissa's voice filled the room. "Yes, leak it. Make it look like she's dating a fraud. That'll teach Sophie Langford what happens when she crosses me." Sophie froze. Her blood turned to ice. "She did this," she whispered. Melissa had planted the story. And George, the man she doubted, the man who'd only ever tried to protect her, was once again paying the price for someone else's cruelty. That night, Sophie drove to Queens. George was outside his old apartment, leaning against the railing, staring at the skyline like he'd been waiting for her. "I should have trusted you," she said as she stepped out of her car. "Sophie, No," she cut him off gently. "I was angry, but not at you, at myself, for letting Melissa win again." He frowned. "Melissa." She handed him her phone, showing the video. As he watched, his jaw tightened. "She won't stop, will she?" "Not until she has no audience left," Sophie said softly. She stepped closer, eyes shining. "I don't care what the world says, George. You made a mistake, but you owned it. And you've been nothing but honest with me since. I let fear talk louder than love." He swallowed hard. "So what now?" She smiled faintly. "Now, we stop hiding." Later that night, they sat by the East River, the city lights shimmering on the water. Sophie leaned her head on his shoulder. "I used to think peace was something you found after the fight," she said quietly. "And now? Now I think peace is choosing to stay, even when it's hard." He kissed her forehead gently. "Then I'll stay as long as it takes." The city skyline glowed under a bruised sunset, each building catching fire-orange light, as if the world itself knew tonight would burn. Sophie adjusted her blazer, walking into the skyline rooftop bar where Melissa had requested a private discussion. George followed, quiet, alert, his hand brushing hers briefly, the gesture small but enough to anchor her. "You sure about this?" he whispered. "I have to be," Sophie replied, tone sharp with determination. "This ends tonight." Melissa was already there, perched on a high stool, long legs crossed, glass of red wine in hand. Her eyes glimmered with both rage and something else, fear maybe. "Sophie," she purred, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" "Cut the act, Melissa," Sophie said, calm but icy. "We know what you've done. You've ruined lives, spread lies, and tried to manipulate us both. Why?" Melissa's laughter was brittle. "Why? Because the world only remembers winners. And you became one I couldn't touch." "Touch," Sophie repeated. "You tried, you failed." The wine glass trembled in Melissa's hand. "You think this is over," she hissed. "I know it is," Sophie said. George stepped forward, his presence steady. "Melissa, it's not just Sophie. You've lost your audience. Your schemes don't work anymore. You can keep spinning or you can face the truth. But the game is over." Melissa's mask cracked. You don't understand," she said, voice shaking. "Nobody ever cared about me. Nobody. I had to fight to exist in a world that ignored me." Sophie's eyes softened slightly. "You hurt people to make yourself feel seen. That's not strength. That's desperation." Melissa's eyes flickered to George. "And he's perfect now. He's everything I can't be." "And he's mine," Sophie said softly. For a moment, the room seemed suspended. Fire-colored sky, distant horns of taxis below, the tension of a city that never sleeps. Melissa set down her glass. "I suppose you're right," she admitted quietly, almost to herself. "I've been fighting ghosts of my own creation." Sophie's phone buzzed. A message from her assistant. Melissa's investors were finally pulling out. Melissa looked around the empty rooftop, a woman stripped of power. "Maybe I needed this," she whispered. Later, Sophie and George walked down the quiet streets of Soho, the city's neon glow reflecting in puddles left by earlier rain. "So that's it?" George asked, keeping one hand tucked in his pocket. "That's it," Sophie said, leaning against him. "The storm is over." He smiled. "You're terrifying when you forgive." "And beautiful when you do," she teased lightly. They stopped at a corner, the hum of the city surrounding them. George brushed hair from her face, eyes soft. "You know," he murmured, "I've survived betrayal, scandal, even lies. But this, being with you, this might be the hardest and best thing I've ever done." Sophie laughed softly, head resting against his chest. "Good, because I don't plan to let you go." He kissed her, slow and deliberate, a promise of love forged in fire and glass, built on trust reclaimed and battles won together. The morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Sophie's penthouse, highlighting the city's pulse below. Today wasn't about revenge or lawsuits or ghosts from the past. Today was about moving forward. Sophie sat at her kitchen island, laptop open, carefully drafting a public statement. George leaned against the counter, sipping coffee, watching her with a mixture of admiration and amusement. "You really know how to make a public announcement sound like poetry," he said. "I try," she replied with a smile, "especially when it involves owning your truth." "Owning my truth," he teased. "Owning our truth," she corrected, glancing at him, eyes soft. By noon, the press event was in full swing. Reporters gathered, cameras clicking, the buzz of anticipation palpable. Sophie stood confidently on the stage, George beside her, not as a trophy, not as a secret, but as her partner. "Thank you all for coming," Sophie began. "I've learned that success isn't just about money, prestige, or appearances. It's about integrity, forgiveness, and the people who stand by you." She paused, letting the words sink in. "George Bennett has been my anchor through challenges I never expected. Today, I want to acknowledge him not just as my partner, but as the person who taught me that love can be patient, resilient, and unconditional." Cameras flashed, journalists scribbled notes, and George's hand found hers under the podium. He squeezed gently, a silent promise. Later, as the reporters filed out, George turned to her. "You did it, public, proud, and unapologetic." "It felt right," she said quietly. "No hiding, no pretending." He smiled. "We've burned bridges with people who never deserved our trust, and built new ones with the people who matter." Sophie nodded. "It's freeing, isn't it?" "Terrifying," George admitted, laughing softly, "but freeing." That evening, they walked through Central Park, the city lights shimmering on the wet pathways. Autumn leaves crunched beneath their feet, the air crisp but comforting. "Do you ever worry about the past catching up with us?" George asked. "Every day," Sophie admitted, "but I also know that the past doesn't define us anymore. We do." He stopped and turned to her, eyes serious, yet tender. "Then let's keep choosing each other, no matter what comes." She smiled, brushing her hand against his cheek. "I thought I'd never believe in love again, but with you, it feels possible." They kissed, slow and deliberate, under the glow of the city. Around them, the world continued its chaos, but for Sophie and George, that chaos felt distant, manageable, almost beautiful. By the time they returned to her penthouse, Sophie felt lighter than she had in years. Melissa's threats had faded, the scandals had passed, and the city's judgment didn't matter anymore. George poured them both a glass of wine. "To bridges burned and bridges built," he toasted. "To us," Sophie replied, clinking her glass against his. They laughed softly, sitting side by side on the couch. For once, the future wasn't a battlefield. It was a horizon, wide and full of possibilities. The last remnants of autumn clung stubbornly to New York City. Leaves drifted lazily down avenues, the air carrying the faint scent of rain and earth. Sophie and George walked hand in hand, heading to George's family home in Queens, a small, warm house filled with laughter, memories, and the grounding presence of family. "It's been a long time since I've seen you smile like this," George's mother said, enveloping Sophie in a hug. "I've had good reasons," Sophie replied softly, glancing at George, whose expression was unreadable but gentle. The visit was simple, comforting, a reminder that love isn't just about passion or drama. It's about connection, roots, and the people who truly see you. That evening, back at Sophie's penthouse, they unpacked boxes from a recent art auction, gifts for their new shared home. Framed prints, small sculptures, and photographs reflected not just wealth, but shared dreams, memories, and a life they were building together. "You know," George said, leaning against the kitchen counter, "I never imagined being in a relationship like this." "Neither did I," Sophie admitted, her voice quiet. "But maybe that's what makes it real. No scripts, no expectations, just us." He reached for her hand. "Nothing, no past betrayal, no gossip, no fear can shake this." "Unshakable," Sophie murmured, echoing the word as if testing it on her tongue. And in that moment, the city lights flickering across the room felt like a silent witness to their promise. A week later, they decided to take a rare night off, just the two of them. They found themselves on a rooftop overlooking Manhattan, the skyline ablaze with lights. The wind tugged at Sophie's hair, but she didn't care. "It's funny," she said, leaning against George, "how we went from chaos, betrayal, and revenge to this. Quiet, beautiful, peaceful." "We earned it," he replied softly. "Not because the world gave it to us, but because we chose each other." The city below seemed to hum in agreement. "Promise me something," George asked, brushing her cheek with his thumb. "Anything." "No matter what happens, we face it together. Nothing can break this bond." Sophie's eyes glistened in the glow of the city lights. "Together," she agreed. They kissed, slow and tender, the kind of kiss that didn't need witnesses or words. It was a culmination of trust, struggle, and love that had weathered storms neither could have faced alone. For the first time, they didn't feel like survivors. They felt unshakable. The morning sun spilled through Sophie's penthouse windows like liquid gold. For the first time in months, she woke up without the weight of revenge, scandal, or fear pressing down on her chest. George was already awake, standing by the balcony, coffee in hand, watching the city stir. "Morning," she said softly, walking over. "Morning," he replied, offering her a mug. "Sleep well." "Better than I have in years," she admitted, leaning against him. They stood in silence for a moment, the hum of Manhattan below them. No calls, no threats, no ghosts from the past, just the quiet rhythm of a life they were choosing together. Later, they walked along the riverside promenade. The autumn air was crisp, leaves drifting along the walkway like nature's confetti. "Do you ever think about everything we went through?" Sophie asked, her voice quiet. "Every day," George said, squeezing her hand. "But I think it made us stronger, closer, real." "Stronger," she teased lightly. "I'd call it exhausted, but okay." He laughed softly. "Fine, exhausted but unbreakable." They reached a small bench overlooking the water. Sophie sat, pulling George down beside her. For a moment, they just watched the river, the city lights reflecting like scattered stars. "I want to say something," George murmured. "Go on," she said, smiling softly. He took a deep breath, his hand covering hers. "I've loved you since the first time we met, in the chaos, in the quiet, in every moment in between. You've made me believe in honesty, in trust, in love I thought I'd lost forever. Sophie Langford, will you spend the rest of this life with me?" Her eyes filled with tears, heart pounding like a drum in her chest. "Yes," she whispered, voice trembling with joy. "Yes, George, I will." He kissed her then, slow and full of everything unspoken, pain, forgiveness, hope, and promise. That evening, they returned to George's family home in Queens. A small celebration awaited family, close friends, and laughter filling the warm rooms. Sophie finally felt completely at home, not because of the house or the luxury, but because of George and the family they were building together. "To Sophie and George," his mother said, raising a glass. "May your hearts always find each other, no matter the storm." They clinked glasses, their smiles radiant and unguarded. "You did it," George said softly, pulling her into his side. "We did it," she corrected, leaning her head on his shoulder. And in that moment, surrounded by love, laughter, and the remnants of battles fought and won, Sophie and George finally understood the truth. Love wasn't just about surviving. It was about choosing each other every day, in every way, and letting the heart of it all guide them home. The city that never sleeps felt different now, quieter, kinder. Sophie stood on her penthouse balcony, the skyline glowing in the soft golden hour. The battles, the betrayals, the chaos, all of it felt like it belonged to another life. George joined her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he murmured. "It is," Sophie replied, resting her head against his chest. "Almost makes me forget how messy life can be." He chuckled softly. "Almost." "Almost," she teased, pressing a kiss to his chest. For the first time, there was no tension, no unspoken fears. Only calm, only the steady rhythm of hearts aligned. Later, they walked through Central Park, the crisp autumn air carrying the scent of fallen leaves and the distant hum of the city. Couples passed by, dogs tugged at leashes, and a street musician played a soft piano melody that seemed meant just for them. "Do you ever think about the past?" George asked quietly. "Sometimes," Sophie admitted, "but I don't let it live with me anymore. It taught me lessons, yes, but it doesn't define our future." He smiled, taking her hand and intertwining their fingers. "Then let's promise to keep walking forward together, no looking back." "Together," she agreed, her voice firm. They stopped by the fountain, the water sparkling like liquid diamonds under the streetlights. George gently pulled her closer. "You know," he said softly, "I never imagined life could feel this peaceful, this real." "Me neither," Sophie whispered, "but I'm grateful it brought me to you." They kissed, slow and unhurried, a kiss that carried the weight of every storm they had weathered, every betrayal they had overcome, and every lesson they had learned. Weeks later, their life settled into a rhythm of joy and quiet contentment. Sophie returned to her work with renewed purpose, but now her decisions were guided by clarity and trust, not fear or resentment. George pursued his passions, still a steady presence at her side, their love no longer a secret, no longer fragile. On weekend mornings, they cooked breakfast together, laughed over spilled coffee, and sometimes simply sat in the quiet, holding hands and listening to the city breathe. Melissa's shadow had faded completely. The scandals, the gossip, the games, all of it had been left behind. Sophie and George had built something stronger than revenge, stronger than fear, stronger than doubt. And in the heart of New York, amid the chaos of life, they had found what they had been searching for all along. Peace, love, each other. The skyline shimmered one last time that night, the city lights reflecting in their eyes as they stood together on the balcony, hearts aligned and unshakable. "We're home," George whispered. "We are," Sophie agreed. And for the first time, the past truly stayed in the past. The end.